Today we're going to talk about four sonnets by three famous Renaissance poets, Shakespeare, John Milton, and Michelangelo. So I gave you two sonnets by Shakespeare. The first is probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, Sonnet 116. This is one that's often read at weddings. So we're going to take it one stanza at a time and just talk through it and kind of paraphrase it in some more contemporary language. So first Shakespeare says, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." So here he's saying, if two people are really in love, I'm not going to get in their way. In fact, I'm going to help them out. So now what he's going to do with the rest of this stanza is he's going to define what love is not. So he's going to define love by what it does not do. He says, "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." So here he's saying it's not really love if it changes when it faces obstacles, or if it bends with any obstacles. So love is going to be constant. Love is not love which changes when it faces difficult times. Now he's going to give us a stanza where he defines love by what it does do, or what it is. He says, "Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken." So love is an unmoving, unchanging mark, and it looks on storms, right? It can last through storms, and even then it won't be shaken. Here he says, "It is the star to every wandering bark." Now here a bark really means a ship. So if you think about the star that guided ships when they were lost, it was the North Star. And of course the North Star is the only star in the sky that doesn't move. So he's comparing love here to the North Star. And this is a metaphor, right? So we have love equals the North Star to wandering lost ships whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Now we're going back to another stanza in which Shakespeare is talking about defining love by what it's not. He says, "Love is not time's fool." Now here he's personifying time, as if time is a person who could make a fool of love. But love cannot be made a fool of. Love is not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come. So love cannot be changed by time, even though time can make our lips and cheeks less rosy and beautiful. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. So he tells us that love is not something that's going to change with time passing, but will bear it out to the edge of doom. And now if we think about the nature of this is love that is serious, that is really mature, and doesn't change, doesn't shake, isn't easily coming and going. And that's going to be something important to remember when we start to read Twelfth Night, because you'll see a different depiction of love there. Now remember, in Shakespearean or English sonnets, the first three quatrains are going to lay out kind of an argument, and then the remaining couplet will answer or address that argument. So our first three stanzas here, we have our first stanza which tells us what love is not, the middle stanza that tells us what love is, and the final stanza that again tells us what love is not. And so Shakespeare finishes by saying, "If this be wrong and upon me proved, I never writ nor no man ever loved." So he's basically saying, if I'm wrong about any of this stuff, then I might as well not have written, and nobody's ever loved anybody. So basically he's saying, I know I'm right about this stuff. So this is Shakespeare's Sonnet 116, and probably his most traditional kind of love poem. His next poem, Sonnet 130, is another one of his famous ones, but it's famous for a different reason. So many sonnets during the Renaissance were used to praise and beautify the love interest, and they often did this by comparing the woman to facets of nature. So your eyes are like stars, your hair is like silk, your skin is like the sunrise, etc. And in this poem, Shakespeare is actually making fun of many of those traditions. Okay, so the first stanza, he says, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun." So we have kind of a reverse simile. Instead of saying her eyes are like the sun, he says her eyes are not like the sun. "Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head." So her lips are not beautifully red. Her skin is kind of brown. In the Renaissance, women who had any kind of like tan or dark skin were seen as lower class because that meant that they had to work outside in the sun. So the paler you were, the more beautiful you were considered to be, because that meant that you never had to work outside. He continues, I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. So I've seen beautiful roses, but I don't see those colors in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. So he's making fun of her breath, and it does not smell like perfume. He says, I love to hear her speak. Yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. So I like to listen to her talk, but the sound of her voice is not beautiful. He says, I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. So he's saying here, I've never seen a goddess walk, and my mistress walks, so she is clearly not a goddess. So again, in the tradition of Shakespearean sonnets, these first 3 quatrains present a scenario in which he is listing out all of the ways that his love interest is really unattractive, and he's going to kind of answer those quatrains with this final couplet. He says here, and yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So here he's saying, you know what? It doesn't matter about all this stuff because I love her in such a rare and perfect way. So we kind of get a resolution here in this final couplet. Next we have John Milton, and he wrote this poem about going blind. Milton went blind very early in his life, unusually early, and he did continue to write after he was blind. He would just dictate to a person who would write down his poems and plays. So this is an Italian sonnet, and instead of the 3 quatrains in the couplet, we're going to have an octave, and then we'll have our volta in the middle after the octave, and then we'll have the sestet that kind of answers or addresses the octave. So here we have, when I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, right? So he's thinking about how he has spent his years being able to see, ere half my days are over. So he's really only about halfway through his life, and he's thinking about how he has spent that time. He says, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless. So here he's referencing the parable of the talent, which comes from the New Testament of the Bible. And in this parable, a father gives a talent or a piece of money to his 2 sons, and he tells them to make the best of what they have, and he'll come back and see how they've done. And one son goes and invests and spreads his talent and multiplies it, and the other son buries his to preserve it. And so when the father comes to check in on the children, he scolds the son who's buried his talent and has not spread it around. And of course that parable was a metaphor for spreading the word of God and serving God. And so Milton here is saying that one talent, which is death to hide, is lodged with me useless. So I have talent. He's using talent in a kind of a double meaning. So both that money from the parable, but also his talent as a writer. And his ability to serve God. It's death to hide that. It's a sin to hide your talent from God, but it's useless with me because I can't see. And he says, it's useless, but my soul is more bent to serve therewith my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide, doth God exact day labor light denied? So he's saying, I want to use my talent to serve God, and I'm afraid that he'll come and scold me. And so he asks, does God expect us to labor if we can't see? But then he says, but patience to prevent that murmur soon reply. So I reply to myself when I ask about God expecting labor from me even though I can't see. He says, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. So God doesn't need anything from us. What he needs from us is just to bear his yoke, here it says, which is basically to be a good servant. But we don't actually have to do anything. God doesn't need gifts or work. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. So Milton is saying here, yes, many servants of God, run around and travel and don't rest, but we also serve God who only stand and wait. So it is possible for Milton to continue his service to God even though he can't see anymore. The last sonnet that I gave you is by Michelangelo, who was, of course, more famous for painting and sculpting. And I gave you this particular sonnet because in it, Michelangelo references painting and sculpting. And he was, like many Renaissance artists, interdisciplinary, so he could do lots of different kinds of things. I also gave you this sonnet because it reflects a common theme of Renaissance poetry, which is the idea of preserving the love interest in a piece of art. So he says, "How can that be, lady, which all men learn by long experience? Shapes that seem alive, wrought in hard mountain marble, will survive their maker whom the years to dust return." So here he says, if I sculpt something, it will outlive me, its maker, because I'm going to return to the dust. Thus to effect cause yields. Art hath her turn, and triumphs over nature. I, who strive with sculpture, know this well. Her wonders live in spite of time and death, whose those tyrants stern. So he's saying, I have sculpted my love interest and beaten nature. So nature will kill me and kill her, but I have preserved her in sculpture, and her wonders live in my artwork. So here we have our volta, where we kind of shift ideas. So I can give long life to both of us in either way, by color or by stone. So he's saying I can preserve both of us together, whether by painting, which is color, or stone, which is sculpture, making the semblance of thy face and mine. Centuries hence, when both are buried, thus thy beauty and my sadness shall be shown, and men shall say, for her 'twas wise to pine. So he's saying even hundreds of years from now, when we're both long dead, they're going to see our beauty in these paintings, and they'll say, you were right to want her and suffer over her and desire her. An interesting tidbit is that Michelangelo wrote many poems, this one included, which initially were written for a man. So Michelangelo was confirmed to be gay. And one of his relatives found his poems and wanted to share them with the world, but was ashamed of his homosexuality, and so changed all of the pronouns to female pronouns. So instead of saying, for her 'twas wise to pine, the poem probably originally said, for him 'twas wise to pine. So I hope that you enjoyed the sonnets. I encourage you to go back to each of them and observe the rhyme schemes and how they're different between the English or Shakespearean and then the Italian sonnet. So the two by Shakespeare have a certain rhyme scheme, and then the poems by Milton and Michelangelo have a different rhyme scheme because they're Italian rather than English. So you do want to become familiar with those. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.